Okay, let's continue with the worlds of Islam, specifically Afro-Eurasian connections from 600 to 1500. The making of an Arab empire. All right, the Arab state eventually included all or part of Egyptian, Roman, Byzantine, Persian, Mesopotamian, and Indian civilizations. And many people, both in and out of the Arab Empire, converted to Islam. And so the Arabic culture and language spread widely. And as Islam became a third wave civilization, or the new third wave civilization. Now, Arabic conquests were a continuation of long-term raiding patterns. And there's a new level of political organization that allowed for greater mobilization. And the Byzantine and Persian empires were weak because of long wars and internal revolts. And from the Iberian Peninsula to the Indus River, Muslim armies spread rapidly out of the Arabian Peninsula. It conquered a large portion of Spain, even attacked France in the west, and reached all the way to the Indus River in the east. Now the Arabs invaded and conquered Egypt, and the Persian Sassanid Empire quickly fell, and the Arabs picked up a huge chunk of Byzantine territory. Now, some of the limits of Arab expansion, they defeated the Sassanid Empire in the 640s and took half of Byzantium. And by the 700s, they'd conquered most of Spain, like what I talked about. But in 751, the Arabs actually crushed a Chinese army at the Battle of Talas River. Now, the Islamic forces defeated the Chinese in Central Asia, and this allowed the Turkic people to become a widespread Islamic culture. In addition, it checked the westward expansion or spread of China. Now, some of the reasons for expansion include economic reasons, the capture of trade routes and agricultural regions. Economic drive quickly spread the faith. Now, the Muslims were eager to spread their faith, but they also were very worldly, or had worldly economic interests. And they did that, or they had those interests in order to build their empire. There were rich trade routes and productive farmlands that increased the wealth of the new and expanding empire. And so individual Arabs also sought wealth and social promotion. Now, the communal reason for expansion meant that conquest helped hold the Ummah together. And remember, Ummah means nation, or any one group of people that has some type of a similarity or commonality. And their religious reason was they wanted to bring a righteous or true government to those that they conquered. And remember, they're tolerant of Jewish and Christian faiths. If conversion was encouraged, and in most cases and locations it was, the empire respected Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. They felt these people were fellow, quote, people of the book. And these groups, therefore, were granted the special status of dhimmi. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And they were required to pay a tax called the jizya, as opposed to military service. However, many who were part of the dhimmi status did serve in the military. But this tolerance allowed these different faiths to continue being practiced. Now, their conquests, and not in all locations, were too destructive. The The soldiers were generally restricted to garrison towns. Remember, garrison towns are towns where troops are usually stationed or located there. And they also incorporated the local elites and the bureaucracies into the empire. And here's a map that shows the spread of Islam during each one of these time periods. Start with under Muhammad, and this is this darker purple area in the Arabian Peninsula. And then from 632 to 656, which, believe it or not, is a time of a lot of fighting, the religion was still able to spread to a huge area of the Middle East and even into Egypt and northern Africa. So all along here in Mesopotamia, parts of Iran and Iraq, well, Iraq's over here, but Iran, and even coming over here into Pakistan and along the Arabian Peninsula. And then during this roughly 100-year period, that's when they conquered the rest of northern Africa. They're able to conquer, like I said, a huge chunk of Spain, part of Armenia up here in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and this is when they get to parts of Central Asia now. And then from 750 to 900, that's when they're able to conquer these different islands, the religion spread to those different islands in the Mediterranean Sea, which it might be kind of odd that it spread to those islands as late as the religion did, because it had spread, this way as opposed to this way. So kind of went like this. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And then, of course, the blue line shows you the boundary of the Abbasid Caliphate, right? Okay. Those are the boundaries of the Caliphate, the Abbasid Empire. But at least you have, based on the color coordination, an idea of where the religion spread and at what time. And, of course, their neighboring empires in the west. The Byzantine Empire, it consisted of most of modern-day Turkey and Greece, even little parts right in there in southeastern Europe. The Lombard Kingdom in Italy, and then, of course, the Carolingian Empire in Europe, which is a good part of France and a little part of Germany right in here. All right, conversion. Now, the initial conversion for many people was a social conversion as opposed to a deep spiritual change. Islam's kinship to Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism made it rather attractive. Now, from the beginning, Islam has been associated with the idea of a powerful state, and that suggested that Allah was a good God to have on your side. And so they saw that as, part of their success. Now, obviously there were some people, and we've hit on these three main points. We'll come back up here to the initial conversion. Obviously, spiritual versus social conversion, there's some room for debate on either side. Now, obviously, there were a lot of people drawn to Islam for spiritual or psychological reasons, but be aware that there were a large number that went through the social conversion, meaning that they shifted from one community to another. And remember, we talked about how important the Hajj is to Muslims, not just religiously, but the social importance and significance that holds. So for some, migrating from one community to another is a big deal. Now, let's talk about the incentives for conversion. How do they convince people to convert to Islam? Well, for starters, many of the early converts came from prisoners of war or slaves, and some merchants. But it's believed that some of them may have even been coerced. However, there were also economic reasons for converting, like avoiding the jizya, right, the tax, as well as the connections that the merchants gained as being part of that large Islamic community. Now, some were able to convert to Islam without Arabizing, what do I want to say? Without making their cultures Arab cultures. Persia, the Turks, and Pakistan, specifically in North Africa and a large part of Mesopotamia, people converted and adopted the Arabic language and culture. But the areas around the Tigris-Euphrates River did not. The Persians, the Turks, and the people of the Indus Valley in India all held on to their own traditional languages, even though they were Islamicized. Hopefully that makes sense. So they were able to maintain some different native aspects to their cultures, despite being influenced by Islam. Now, some of the Persian influences. Okay, sorry about that. I went to the wrong slide. Now, some of the Persian influences on Islam, Persia is a centuries-old civilization. And so they held on to many of their own traditions. And many of these traditions actually spread into the Muslim world. And so this is one of those cultures that had an impact on Islam. Like Persian architecture, administration, and art all influenced the culture, even in the eastern parts of where Islam had reached. Many Persian scholars and artists were the ones that documented many different events and activities and art from this time. And even other groups of people are impressed with Persian administration and military skills. So they didn't just have an impact on Islam, but others as well. Okay. Now there was some resistance to converting, specifically the Berbers in North Africa, and some of the Spanish Christians and some Persian Zoroastrians. But about 80% of the population of Persia converted between 750 and 900. Let's see. I was going to write on there, but I guess it won't let me. That's okay. Anyway, Persia, about 80% of the population, 750 to 900. Now, some areas, like Egypt, North Africa, and Iraq, also converted to the Arabic culture and language, like I was talking about earlier. But, like the people in Iran and Turkey, around Mesopotamia, and Pakistan, they Islamized without Arabizing. Arabizing. I don't know if I mean, hopefully that makes sense. So they took on a new religion, but didn't exactly severely alter their culture. And like we mentioned earlier, the Persians had a big influence on the Islamic world with language and culture. So they were very important. All right, divisions and controversies. One of the central problems after the death of Muhammad was who should serve as his successor, who should be the caliph. Right, Muhammad was seen as the leading political and religious ruler, and he passed away in what year was it? 632, I believe, and 632. And they didn't know who was going to be caliph. Now, the first 4 caliphs that came after the death of Muhammad were called the rightly guided caliphs. And they were companions of Muhammad. And they had to put down rebellions and even new prophets. And 2 of those rightly guided caliphs, Uthman and Ali, were both assassinated. But the civil war finally ended in 656. And so all that time and energy and resources and effort that Muhammad had put in to unite the Arabs, he did it via religion, the civil war threatened to take that all away and tear down what he had built. And the result is the Sunni Shia split of Islam. Now, so let's look at these 2 different divisions of Islam. Now, the Sunni Muslims believed that the caliphs were rightful political and military leaders, and they should be chosen by the Islamic community. But the Shia Muslims believe that the leaders should be blood relatives of Muhammad, right, descending from Ali and even his son, Hussein. I believe that's how you pronounce that. And so it started out as a political conflict, right? They needed a caliph as leader, became a religious conflict. And the Shia Muslims eventually identified themselves as opponents of privilege. Or they had to work. They weren't given anything. They didn't live a life of luxury. And so there was pride in that. But the caliphs became absolute monarchs. And remember, we discussed absolute monarchs as being a king or queen or someone in control that has a hereditary line of succession as being the supreme ruler. What they say goes. There's no negotiations, questions. Whatever their decision is, that's what happens. They have that kind of power. Now, first there's the Umayyad dynasty from 661 and 750, which basically came into power after that civil war. And this was a time of great expansion, right? Remember, this is about that 100-year period where Islam spread in essentially all directions. But eventually, they were overthrown by the Abbasids in 750. And so a new religious issue arose. What does it mean to be Muslim? And this was essential for them to determine the answer. So they looked to Islamic law or the Sharia. And that helped them with some answers. The Sufis, their reaction against the distraction of worldly success and merchants and money and economic interests was different than before and what Islam had been founded on. And the youth, I think it's ulema, I think that's how you say that, and Sufism were not compatible. They just didn't work, didn't really get along. And make sure. Got this here. Okay. I'm going to make sure I give you some of the correct information. Sorry, I had to double check my notes. Now, the Umayyad dynasty, the capital was not actually in Medina, but this dynasty actually was part of the old Roman Empire, and they had the Byzantine city of Damascus. And it provided unity for the Muslims, but also faced a series of revolts. And that's where the Abbasids came in. And their capital, they moved to Baghdad. But however, they too were soon faced with revolts and made it very easy for the Mongols to defeat the Abbasids in 1258. Now remember, the Sufis, they're kind of like mystics. They didn't, there's that idea of popular Islam. They didn't always believe that it was necessary to follow the letter of the law. And so, through ritual and meditation, that's how they received a close spiritual contact with the divine. And so, many Sufis describe their relationship with the divine as overwhelming and intoxicating, because there is that strong spiritual connection and relationship. Okay, women and men in early Islam. The role of women in Islam for a long time has been a controversial topic. Now, on a spiritual level, the Quran viewed women as equals, men and women as equals, and it's explicitly stated as such. But on a social level, the Quran viewed women as subordinate, especially in marriage. However, the Quran helped women in many ways. It banned female infanticide. Women were allowed to control their own property. They were granted some rights of inheritance. And there was always a requirement of a woman's consent to be married as opposed to arranged marriages. And there was a recognition to a woman's right to sexual satisfaction. Now, social practices are important in defining women's roles in Islam. Now, in early Islam, women were actually allowed to play public roles. They prayed in mosques. They didn't necessarily have to wear veils, and they weren't secluded from society. But during the Abbasids, there were growing restrictions placed on women, especially the upper classes. And that was their way of controlling women. So veiling and seclusion became the standard for those elite classes. But the lower class women, they didn't have the quote-unquote luxury of seclusion. And so many of these practices for Islam are actually determined by Middle Eastern traditions as opposed to what was in the Quran. Now the hadiths, these are the traditions described by Muhammad and about Muhammad. It developed a more negative image of women. But Islam actually did give new religious outlet for women, especially as Sufis, where different cultural aspects were combined with the beliefs of Islam, and in the Shia tradition of the mullahs. I thought I had. I guess I don't. Oh, there it is. Okay. So this is a really neat image that shows the seclusion of men and women. This is actually, this whole painting is a mosque with men praying in one area and women and children playing in another area. Women, they're also not just separated from the men, but they're also dressed in white as opposed to the many colors that the men are dressed in. And that's pretty interesting. Notice their heads are fully covered. Well, essentially. I think that's the idea. Except for their eyes. Well, not that one. Or that one. But most of these women you can see, right, like this one and this one, their heads covered except for their eyes. And I would just guess that the writing down here and up here may suggest that this image might be from a book. That's always possible. So what does this image suggest about the place of women in Islamic religion and Islamic society? All right, we obviously get the segregation and the seclusion even in a mosque, but they weren't excluded. And it seems to me like maybe the arrangement of the congregation between men and women are between men and women reflects their social hierarchy in society. Right, men are placed above women, yet spiritually men and women are both members of the mosque community. And so it's a matter of debate as to what extent women's social inequality actually affects women's spiritual equality. So it's an interesting thought. And that is the conclusion of Section 2, the making of an Arab Empire.